So I suppose we're going to start here in East London because that's where we are based at the moment and where this hospital is. But I'm not actually personally a Cockney, and many of the characteristics of Cockney, which is basically the inability to pronounce the letter R. Everything is a R, and the mouth is quite lazy. I'm actually more from the south of England and just speaking generally sort of what used to be Queen's English but now is a King's English. But on the south coast it gets a bit more it gets a bit more Londonified estuary English in general, and that's quite interesting. In Sussex originally there's much more kind of like gets a bit rustic, as it would like get the more west you go with your accent. But equally, you might go much more like Norfolk, which is much more like that, but a difficult one to do. But anyway, I'm not actually from round there. My mother is actually from Liverpool originally. The thing about Liverpool, everyone knows how to do Liverpool because it's associated with soap operas and things like that. But if I was going to leave you with a couple of ideas about, how to do it, you don't go to work, you go to work, and you don't like things, you like them, and you don't ride a bike, you ride a bike in general. And there's a big relationship, obviously, between Liverpool demographically and with the Republic of Ireland. So most obviously taking you to the Irish accent and a sort of Dublin accent. And I tend to do that by putting a bit of lisp into that, which is mostly derived from Dubliners records. And it says things like, instead of saying about, you say about, and instead of going out, you go out, and so on like that. Now, further down the coast, it gets a bit more delicate and a little bit more dental. So I got a friend whose family are from Wexford, and it sounds quite sort of like a sort of very tidy little accent there. But of course, and then you can go much more singy and much more a traditional sort of Ireland. It's sort of, it's been a few years now since we've ever heard from him, that kind of thing like that. But equally, the fascinating thing about Ireland, given its very small population relatively, is how absolutely diverse the actual accents around Ireland are, and obviously that takes us to the north, and that is the sound, a little bit of Scottish. And you don't live in a house, you live in a house, and you don't go out and about, you go out and about, and you got a small number of population, a small 2 degrees of separation, so it's quite normal if you see a child messing around, you say, what's your name and who's your daddy? And soon enough you find it. But of course, there's obviously a lot of migration went over from Scotland to Ireland, and I tend to default as a matter of course to Glasgow. And the thing about the Glaswegian accent in general is the absolute importance of getting that labial dental, basically, the tongue on the back of the teeth. So good, you don't say good, you say good. That's pretty good actually that we're able to do that. The only difference I can really detect between Glasgow and Edinburgh, I tend to associate Edinburgh as a little bit more posh and a little bit more dental. Yes, we've opened up a legal practice in our Edinburgh office. You're much more likely to have a legal practice or an Edinburgh-based office rather than a Glasgow office. Glasgow is going to be much more street talking, but much more, kind of mouthy like that. So anyway, that brings us let's go over to where I was born. I was actually born in Toronto. And there's not a great deal of stuff I can say about that apart from the very stereotypical thing about Canadians saying bout rather than. I actually find American accents actually surprisingly hard. And everyone can do in New York, obviously. It's very stereotypical. That's kind of embarrassing. It's one of those accents I don't actually like doing much because it's so stereotypical. And then we go over to San Francisco, which is much more chatty, much more, I don't know, I'm just like, anyway, over here. Where are we going to go from here? I guess we might go over to, we might look at China for a little bit. I mean, stereotypically, obviously, Germans, we tend to think of, Achtung, schnell, was ist mit dem Mund and all that. But I think it's more generally, I would associate it in the modern age with much more sort of just general considered, quite precise language and general sort of clear ways of speaking, and often quite keen to integrate pretty well with British accents or with American accents when they do. French, I mean, what can you say about the French accent? Apart from, as I would say in general, there's one country that gets away with absolute murder, with making huge mistakes when it comes to basic pronunciation of words. We are looking at different advertisements and things like that. It is France. There are people who get away with speaking bad English the most. The Dutch are quite interesting. You can hear the Dutch in the way they pronounce Dutch. They never say Dutch, they say Dutch. Yeah, so and they do this sort of liberal way of speaking, so I don't know how it works. I spoke to them for 3 hours and no one seems to know what's going on. But it's also the Dutch democracy and the relative flat pyramid of their society, such that they can say things like, you can be sitting next to the Dutch managing director and the Junie will say, I think that is a really bad idea. It's not going to work. That whole system is totally shit. And there'll be absolutely no problems. I would say generally the Mediterranean for me with English, I associate it generally with very able people who are just able to get on with things, and they generally have lived all over the world. I was working for Google for a couple of years, and then maybe I spent a couple of years working at Facebook. I mean, people are pretty easy to get on with. I just don't like the way they do their discipline. You know, they have some pretty good developers. So this is the sort of generic kind of, progressive, futuristic English I see. Whereas the Danes, I don't know, that's kind of pretty straightforward. I mean, yeah, Norwegians, yeah. Finns, I would do as being quite laconic. So we went over to Thailand and we had a very good time. We drank a lot of beer, but it is very, very, very nice place. Anyway, so let's go all the way down here to, this is an interesting one because obviously this was an accent that was very taboo when I was growing up, and we would have members of staff at the war grave who were basically what get called British South Africans, even though they had been in South Africa for maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They would say things like, well, she's nice, but she's nice from far, but she's far from nice. And they would say things like, to kiss a girl, they would say, well, I didn't get too far, but I managed to suck face, which was one of the most ugly expressions I've ever heard. Anyway, that lot now, they're typically living in Australia, New Zealand, Europe. They typically migrated from South Africa. So you tend to get a generic kind of highly diluted version of South African, which is almost imperceptible, but sometimes you'll hear it a little bit. So things like in Australia or in Europe, they'll sound like this. They'll be like, yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty good idea, actually. I think we should probably run with it. I don't think it's a problem. I'm just a bit worried about the customers not really understanding it. Anyway, brings us to the Mizrach HaTichon. Now, Israel is an interesting one because it's one of the challenges of speaking about any accent is trying to avoid yourself speaking and reproducing obvious stereotypes. So take Northern Ireland, for example. We can all do Jerry Adams and Ian Paisley saying, no, this is not enough. Sinn Féin has done enough, and so like that. The secret is to actually do it in a way that maybe someone like yourself might do if they were sitting there at a dinner. Anyway, Israel is very, very Americanized these days, and, it's pretty hard to say. I could say I've been working in San Francisco for several years and for a tech company, and, you wouldn't even hear it. Could be generic, I could be a Greek, I could be an Italian, but there was an older generation of Israelis, best exemplified by people like Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, who were much more, you have to work tomorrow, we have to get up, we have to fight for the right to party. And that generation has almost gone now. India, I mean, where to start? The difficulty with India is that it sounds very, very like Welsh. Very difficult, Welsh to India, because they are very close. But I would say, in general, one of the things I find most interesting about India, how much business school influence there is in that. But you can also hear a much less educated Indian who can't say wa, they say vi. So we are going to buy some new software for the company so that we can develop a new so it becomes very, very I'm not going to bother with them because this is too controversial. Australia obviously is what it is. It's a wonderfully drawling, heavy Cockney accented experience you're hearing there, and you kind of can't separate Australia from the Australian character, which is very, very kind of tall poppy hating, kind of like, yeah, all right, real kind of like, kind of a bit of Texan sometimes. And I do it as a real toothy sort of like, well, she came over and parked the car on the lawn and I'm absolutely disgusted with what happens. Whereas this place, it's very sweet-natured, like Kiwis and like the little monkey in my life. And I associate that with something that's much more private. It's almost like them trying to be a bit more shy. It's a bit like the version of the British as maybe the Northern Welsh or the Irish. So in a sense of like, it gets quite introspective and it gets quite high in the mouth. And there's a certain type of Kiwi accent that gets really, really, really clucky. And I know certain people, we went out there and we had an absolutely lovely meal and they had some tartare sauce and it was absolutely beautiful. Then going over to, we can all do the Deep South. We've all watched, Dukes of Hazzard and stuff like that. But I don't think, again, this is the kind of accent that I don't like doing that. I sometimes see this on OnlyFans. Well, boys are ringing me up asking me to sell them my flip-flops. I don't want to sell no one my flip-flops. It's kind of, that's the weird thing. South America, genetic Arab world, there is a sort of, you get the extremes of, what Israel has to understand is that there is a radical revolution against the Republic of It's very, very clucky. It is the 7th time that we are writing. It's very that. Have I missed out anything? Aussies, Kiwis, these cunts will, of course, I think typically you got an educated Russian who's like a bit, quite a bit of American culture in there as well. Historically, we used to always imagine them to be these balalaika strumming, people in very cold weather with very deep voices, and the mouth was always in the mouth, very, very far back because of the cold. And there was a kind of a romance about the Ruski, because they were like, people thought of them as the Italians of the East. People like my father's generation tend to romanticize Russians. What I would say now is more obvious in the way the kind of words that they do not use. So you can see the absence of the definitive and indefinite article. So it rain, I buy him new car, he'd not pay me for my car. But this is a difficult accent. What I would say is, if you ever see Russian accents being done by bad British actors, and my favorite example is John Cleese in The Fish Called Wanda, where he is doing a sort of and there's this bit where he is supposed to be reciting a poem, and he's going, Буря морглю, небо кроет, вихри снежные. Это не то. Это буря мглю, небо кроет, вихри снежные, так. То, как зверя называют, то заплачет, как дитя. Poland, this is to stereotype, but I would think the Polish are stuck between the Germans and the Russians.